You can't walk in purpose while hiding. And today, that ends. Because somewhere along the way, you learned how to survive, but not how to be free. You mastered the mask, smiling on the outside while silently breaking on the inside. But here, you don't have to hide. Here, we get real with biblical truth. Here, we heal through God's grace. Here, we rise into the woman He created us to be. Here, we live like we've got no more no's to give, just faith in action. Welcome to Wholly Unmasked. Live uncovered, unashamed, and unleashed. Hey y'all, I'm Brienne. Welcome back to Wholly Unmasked. I just want to start with a disclaimer today. If you're watching online, lately I've been dressed in shorts and summer dresses. I'm not sure where you're watching from, but here in South Louisiana, the heat is disrespectfully hot. I feel like my women role models in life definitely instilled the Southern Belle way in me, but for now, I'm going against the grain. I'm just trying to survive, so bear with me and extend a little bit of grace my way, please. Okay, so now that that's out the way, today we're talking about one of the hardest things God will ever ask us to do: forgive. Not the easy kind. Not forgiving the person who accidentally bumped into your shopping cart at Walmart. Not forgiving your husband for saying he's going to fix something this weekend and somehow we're celebrating the anniversary of the broken thing. I'm talking about forgiving what still hurts: the betrayal, the rejection, the abandonment, the lies, the disappointment, the wound that happened years ago, but somehow still feels fresh when you think about it. The person who altered the course of your life and then walked away like nothing happened. Because if we're being honest, forgiveness sounds beautiful until it's personal. We love hearing sermons about grace. We love hearing about mercy. We love talking about how Jesus forgave us. But the second we're asked to extend that same forgiveness to someone who deeply wounded us, suddenly it gets complicated. And maybe you're listening today carrying a hurt that nobody else can see. You smile, you show up, you go to church, you serve, you function. But every now and then, something reminds you of what happened. That trigger happens. And it's like the wound rips back open all over again. Friend, if that's you, I want you to know something. You are not alone. And more importantly, God isn't asking you to pretend it didn't hurt. Let's start building the foundation that we're going to stand on today. Colossians 3:13 says, "Bear with one another and forgive one another. If anyone has a grievance against another, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you are also to forgive." Now, let's be real for a second. That's one of those verses that's easy to quote, but not so easy to live, to actually walk out. Because forgiving people sounds great until somebody gives us a reason not to. And if you're anything like me, there have been seasons where I thought I had forgiven someone until their name came up. And then suddenly I'm having an entire imaginary courtroom trial in my head, presenting evidence, calling witnesses, making closing arguments, and finding them guilty all over again. Can anybody relate to that? Maybe this is from my background with law enforcement. or maybe it's from the thousands of true crime documentaries I watch. But if you take a second here to be 100% honest and unmasked, I'd be willing to bet you'd find your own version of this too. Maybe not in a courtroom type setting, but nonetheless, your own version. Because hurt has a way of keeping receipts. We remember the conversation, the text message, the moment everything changed. And before long, we become collectors, but not of anything shiny or valuable. We start to become collectors of debts. They owe us an apology. They owe us an explanation. They owe us accountability. They owe us acknowledgement. And the longer we carry those debts, the heavier they become. What starts as pain eventually becomes bitterness. And bitterness is sneaky because it convinces us that we're protecting ourselves when really we're poisoning ourselves. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. They may not even know that we're carrying it, but you're the one suffering under the weight of it. So I thought to myself, what better biblical example do we have of this other than Joseph? So let's talk about Joseph and his brothers. Because if anybody had a reason to stay bitter, it was Joseph. But you should also know by now, I'm not going to ask you just to take my word for it. I'm going to lay it all out for you. So Joseph was born to Jacob, who was also named Israel, and Rachel. Genesis 37:3 reads, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was born to him in old age, and he made a long sleeved robe for him." Okay, this alone is a pretty loaded statement. He loved Joseph more than his other sons. Joseph was the firstborn son to Rachel, and she would eventually go on to have one more son, Benjamin. But Jacob had 6 sons with Leah and 3 more sons with 2 handmaids. So 12 in total. Make a mental sticky note of that. But if we go back even further before the birth of any children, we learn that underhanded, deceptive tactics were kind of a thing for this family. Scripture tells us that Jacob fell deeply in love with Laban, his uncle, his youngest daughter, Rachel. But because he had no money for a dowry, Jacob agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. A dowry was basically a payment or gift given by the groom to the bride's family before the marriage was allowed to take place. After the 7 years he agreed to work were complete, Laban hosted a large wedding feast. But when night fell, Laban secretly switched his daughters. He had Leah wear a thick bridal veil, and it concealed her identity. So in the dark bridal tent, Jacob couldn't see her face. Jacob only realized that he consummated the marriage with Leah, the wrong sister, the next morning. When a furious Jacob confronted him, Laban claimed it was against their local custom to marry off a younger daughter before the firstborn. So to finally marry Rachel, Jacob had to agree to wait until Leah's wedding week celebration was over. Laban then gave him Rachel as a second wife, but forced Jacob to work an additional 7 years to pay the dowry for her. 14 years spent working to be able to marry the woman that his heart loved. I don't know about y'all, but that is a level of dedication I don't think any of us know. So it should come as no surprise to us that this sneaky and deceptive concept of life continued on in the sons. So now fast forward, we've got Joseph, clearly his dad's favorite, walking around in his special robe, the one we all know from kids' church as the coat of many colors. And of course, this was the birthplace of bitterness for his brothers. As a teenager, Joseph worked alongside some of his brothers and would report back to his dad on what they were doing wrong. Now, was Joseph being responsible or acting immaturely by reporting back? We don't know. What we do know is the brothers viewed him as a rat, the tattletale, and this only grew their resentment for him. God gave Joseph prophetic dreams. In one dream, bundles of grain belonging to his brothers bowed down to his bundle. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. Go back to that middle sticky note. Don't forget, Jacob had 12 sons in total. The dream pointed towards Joseph's future leadership and authority. But when he shared those dreams, his brothers became furious. To them, it sounded like, one day you will all bow down to me. Instead of seeing God's hand, they saw arrogance. When Joseph shared the second dream, even Jacob rebuked him. The suggestion that his parents and brothers would bow before him seemed outrageous. Scripture says Jacob kept the matter in mind, wondering if there might be more to the dream. Genesis repeatedly says Joseph's brothers hated him. They hated the favoritism, the special robe, the reports he brought home, the dreams, the possibility that Joseph would one day rule over them. And their jealousy turned into deep-rooted hatred. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were tending to flocks far from home. When they saw Joseph approaching in the distance, they began plotting. They said, "Here comes that dreamer." Their plan was initially murder. They intended to kill him and throw his body into a pit. Joseph's oldest brother, Reuben, convinced them not to kill him. Instead, they stripped him of his robe and threw him into an empty cistern, a pit, basically. Reuben secretly had planned to go back and rescue Jacob later. While Joseph sat in the pit, a caravan of traders passed by. Judah proposed, "What profit is it if we kill him?" He suggested selling Joseph instead. And all the brothers agreed and sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to travelers that were traveling towards Egypt. To cover up what they had done, they slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's robe in blood. And they brought it to Jacob and allowed him to believe that a wild animal had killed Joseph. Jacob mourned deeply, believing that his beloved son was dead. What Joseph's brothers intended as betrayal, God used as preparation. So, to sum it all up, his brothers hated him, considered murdering him, but decided to make a profit instead, sold him into slavery, lied to their father, watched him disappear, and went on with their everyday life. What? Can we just pause right here? Because sibling rivalry in my house looks like arguing over the TV remote, maybe a bag of Takis, or who the one working phone charger actually belongs to. But Joseph's brothers, they were straight gangsters. Joseph's brothers said, "Let's sell him." That escalated quickly. I can't help but to laugh thinking back to when Stephen and I told Ren and Ainsley that we were pregnant with Jeff Michael. Ren was 4, Ainsley was 2. And when we told them, Ren wanted to know if we were going to trade Ainsley for a new baby. Poor kid. He had gone from being the only child for the better half of 4 years to having a sister and now a new baby on the way. Surely we weren't planning to keep both of them. But Joseph's brothers, they meant business. Joseph loses everything: his home, his family, his future, his freedom. Then, when he finally starts rebuilding his life, he's falsely accused and thrown into prison. After Joseph was sold into slavery and taken to Egypt, he was purchased by Potiphar, a high ranking officer in Pharaoh's household. Joseph quickly earned Potiphar's trust and was placed in charge of the entire household. Scripture says that God blessed everything Joseph did. Potiphar's wife became attracted to Joseph and repeatedly tried to persuade him to sleep with her. Day after day, she pursued him, but Joseph refused, saying Potiphar had trusted him with everything. Sleeping with her would betray that trust, and it was a sin against God. But one day, when no one else was in the house, she grabbed Joseph by his garment and demanded that he sleep with her. Joseph fled, leaving his cloak behind in her hand. Humiliated and angry at being rejected, Potiphar's wife used the cloak as evidence and falsely accused Joseph of trying to sexually assault her. She told the servants and later her husband that Joseph had come to attack her and that she had screamed, causing him to run away and leave his cloak behind. And even though Joseph was innocent, Potiphar believed the accusation, or at least acted on it, and had Joseph thrown into prison. So Joseph has gone from favored son to slave to trusted household manager to prisoner, all because of a lie. Joseph suffered for doing the right thing. He resisted temptation, honored God, and maintained his integrity, yet he still faced severe consequences. This part of Joseph's story reminds us that obedience doesn't always produce immediate reward. Sometimes faithfulness leads us through seasons that seem unfair. Yet, even in prison, God remained with Joseph and continued preparing him for the purpose he had planned all along. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. Genesis 39:21. Joseph is the textbook example of a statement I made a few weeks ago. I think one of the hardest truths for believers is realizing that following Jesus does not exempt us from battles. Most of us would have understood if Joseph stayed angry. Most of us would have said he earned the right to be angry. So let's fast forward a little bit more. Joseph's character gets noticed in prison by the warden. So eventually he's put in charge of prison affairs. In my mind, this is Joseph being named head trustee. You know, the one all the officers trust, the one they pack an extra snack in their work lunchbox for, buy a Coke for just to be kind. I'm not speaking from experience or anything. Which is how he comes across to the Pharaoh's court officials that were thrown into prison, the cupbearer and the chief baker. Both of these men were having wild dreams, and they tell Joseph about them. Joseph explained that interpretations belong to God, and then he interpreted their dreams. The cupbearer would be restored to Pharaoh's service in 3 days. The baker, he would be executed in 3 days. And they, exactly as Joseph predicted, both of these things happened. Before the cupbearer left prison, Joseph asked him, though, remember me when it is well with you. But after being restored to Pharaoh's service, the cupbearer, he forgets Joseph. For 2 more years, Joseph remained in prison. Then Pharaoh himself starts having these disturbing dreams. 7 healthy cows were eaten by 7 thin cows. 7 healthy heads of grain were swallowed by 7 thin heads of grain. None of Pharaoh's wise men could explain these dreams. And at that moment, the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. And he goes to Pharaoh and tells them about this Hebrew prisoner who had accurately interpreted his dreams. Joseph was quickly brought out of prison, shaved, cleaned up, and brought to Pharaoh. When Pharaoh asked him if he could interpret dreams, Joseph gave God the credit. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Genesis 41:16. Let's sit on that for a second. He's finally seeing a little light at the end of his tunnel, maybe a shot at freedom. And instead of taking credit himself, he still remains humble and gives God all the glory. Talk about a whole different level of faith. So Joseph explains to Pharaoh that 7 healthy cows and grain represent 7 years of abundance. The 7 thin cows and grain represent 7 years of severe famine that would follow. So he advises Pharaoh to appoint a wise administrator to store grain during the abundant years. Pharaoh recognizes God's wisdom in Joseph and immediately promoted him. Joseph went from prisoner to ruler in a single day. Pharaoh made him second in command over all of Egypt, placing only Pharaoh himself above Joseph. Joseph wasn't released because he fought harder, complained louder, or manipulated circumstances. He was released because God's timing had arrived. The same exact gift that seemed to cause so many problems earlier in his life, his dreams and the ability to interpret dreams, became the very thing God used to bring him into his purpose. Just as Joseph had interpreted, Egypt experienced 7 years of abundance when the grain was stored, followed by 7 years of famine. The famine wasn't just limited to Egypt, though. It affected the surrounding regions as well, including where Joseph's family lived. When Jacob heard that there was grain available in Egypt, he sent 10 of Joseph's brothers there to buy food. He kept Joseph's younger brother Benjamin at home, though, because he was scared something might happen to him. When the brothers arrived in Egypt, they stood before the official in charge of distributing the grain. That official was Joseph. The brothers didn't even recognize him. More than 20 years had passed. Joseph was now dressed and speaking like an Egyptian ruler. And honestly, they just believed Joseph was either dead or gone forever. But Joseph, he recognized them immediately. And then something incredible happened. They bowed before him. At that moment, Joseph remembered the dreams God had given him as a teenager, the dreams that had caused so much jealousy and anger. The brothers who once mocked the dreamer were now unknowingly fulfilling those dreams. Joseph did not immediately reveal who he was. Instead, he tested them to see whether they had changed or not. Over several encounters, he accused them of being spies, held Simon in Egypt, demanded that they return with Benjamin, the baby brother, secretly return their money in their grain sacks. Later, he placed his silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accused Benjamin of theft. But these tests weren't about revenge. Joseph was trying to determine whether his brothers were still selfish and jealous men or whether God had transformed them. And the most moving moment comes when Judah offers himself as a substitute for Benjamin. Wait, what? Years earlier, Judah was the one who suggested selling Joseph. Now, he was willing to sacrifice himself to save his baby brother and spare his father's grief. Joseph finally saw that his brothers had changed, and unable to contain his emotions any longer, Joseph sent everyone else out of the room and wept loudly. And then he said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Genesis 45:3. His brothers were stunned and understandably terrified. The brother they had betrayed and sold into slavery was now one of the most powerful men in the world. Talk about a plot twist. Instead of punishing them, Joseph comforted them. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Genesis 45:5. What's powerful is that Joseph says this after everything is over, after the pit, slavery, the false accusation, the prison, and the years of waiting. He doesn't say, what you did wasn't wrong. It didn't hurt. Let's pretend it never happened. His brothers really did betray him. Their motives were jealousy, hatred, and resentment. And then the mic drop comes. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20. He acknowledges the truth. You meant evil. Wait, what? How? How does someone forget that? Because Joseph understood something we often forget. Forgiveness doesn't change what happened, it changes who carries it. Joseph stopped carrying what belonged to God. And that's what forgiveness really is. Not saying they were right, not saying it didn't hurt, not saying there shouldn't be consequences. Forgiveness is releasing the situation into God's hands. The greatest example of forgiveness is Jesus himself. And honestly, it kind of wrecks me every time I think about it because Jesus wasn't forgiving people after they apologized. No, ma'am, they weren't sorry. They weren't repentant. They weren't making amends. They were actively crucifying him, mocking him, spitting on him, beating him, rejecting him. And still, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. Can we just sit with that for a second? Because most of us struggle forgiving people for what they said about us. Jesus forgave the people killing him. That kind of forgiveness doesn't make sense in the natural, but it's because biblical forgiveness isn't natural. It's supernatural. It's the evidence that God is doing something inside of us that we could never do on our own. I'll be honest, one of the hardest prayers I've ever prayed is this: God, I release them to you. Not because they deserved it, not because they apologized, not because justice didn't matter, but because I finally realized that I was carrying something that God never asked me to carry. Friends, some of you are exhausted. And hear me when I say, I understand that exhaustion, not because of what happened, but because you're still holding on to it every day, every memory, every offense, every betrayal, every unanswered question. And God is saying, give it to me, not because he doesn't care, but because he cares more than you do. He saw every tear, every sleepless night, every panic attack, every moment you questioned your worth. He knows. And unlike us, God is perfectly just. He doesn't overlook wrongdoing. He doesn't miss details. He doesn't need our help being God. Sometimes releasing people to God means accepting that we may never get the apology that we deserve. And that's hard because we want closure. We want answers. We want accountability. But healing cannot depend on another person's willingness to change. Otherwise, they still control your freedom. I think one of the biggest mistakes Christians make is trying to rush healing. For me personally, I know this is one of the biggest stumbling stones that I continue to throw myself down over. People say things like, just let it go. You stayed, so you must be okay with it. Move on. Get over it. And I know that they usually mean well, but healing doesn't happen through denial. Healing happens through honesty. Jesus never ignored wounds, he acknowledged them, he touched them, he healed them. Friend, if it hurt, it hurt. You don't have to minimize it. You don't have to compare it. You don't have to explain it away. You can acknowledge the wound without living in it. And sometimes that's the bravest thing you'll ever do, to look at the pain honestly and still choose forgiveness. Not because it wasn't significant, but because God is bigger than it. I will never forget the moment I felt the conviction of my unforgiveness. I was sitting in church in this same spot I sit every single Wednesday night because I really despise change. I thrive on routine. And for the life of me, I could not understand what was causing my spiritual block, we'll call it. I was spending time in prayer, spending time reading the word, starting to more faithfully give my yes, really starting to understand things better through our church study of the necessity of an enemy. And still, I felt like I was stuck in place. What was holding me down? I had no clue until that Wednesday night. I listened to our pastor speak on forgiveness. And the conviction I felt was so heavy and so clear. I had forgiven Stephen years before, but never heard. Why would I forgive someone who never apologized, never acknowledged the blazing path of destruction left in their wake? Sitting there at church, I prayed, God, I don't know how to forgive her, but you do. Show my heart to do what you're asking me to do. I'd love to sit here and tell you I immediately felt relief and a firework display straight from heaven happened right there in church. But, well, I'm sure you already know the answer on that one. Instead, I said that prayer several times over the next few days. Fast forward to the end of that week. I'm laying in bed, can't sleep, so I start scrolling on Facebook. And as I scrolled, there she was. A mutual friend of ours had posted pictures, and she was right there in them, right in front of me. And it was in that exact moment I realized my simple prayer was more than enough. For the very first time in years, I saw her face and felt nothing like I always had before. No anger, no hatred, no sadness. My stomach didn't turn. And my first thought was, I hope she's found peace. I know how bizarre this might sound to some, but it was a surreal moment for me. God helped my heart forgive with no apology extended, unsure if there was even any regret for the actions that broke me to my core. Just like that. I didn't even realize just how heavy the weight of that unforgiveness was on me and had affected everything and everyone around me until I released it to Him. I'm not sure who this is for today, but if you're carrying unforgiveness, hear me clearly. Eventually, the weight of it will begin to crush you. Unforgiveness was never yours to carry. The question God is asking isn't complicated. Do you trust me enough to give it to me? So let me ask you point blank. Do you trust Him enough to release the offense, the hurt, and let Him handle what you can't? Because forgiveness, it begins where surrender starts. And I am a living, walking, breathing example of this. And you can be too. Here's something that nobody told me. Sometimes forgiveness isn't one moment. Sometimes it's a process. You forgive, then the memory comes back. You forgive again. Then a trigger happens. You forgive again. Their name comes up. You forgive again. That's not failure. Friend, that's healing. The deeper the wound, the more often you may have to surrender it. not because your forgiveness wasn't real, but because healing takes time. And every single time that you release it back to God, you're choosing freedom again. Maybe today you're holding on to something that happened years ago. Maybe it's a parent, a spouse, a friend, a church hurt, a betrayal, a wound that maybe nobody even knows about. And maybe you've convinced yourself that holding on to the hurt somehow protects you. But friend, what if the thing you think you're holding on to is actually holding on to you? What if freedom is waiting on the other side of your forgiveness? Not because the pain wasn't real, not because the wound wasn't deep, but because God never intended for you to stay chained to it. Forgiveness doesn't excuse what happened. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Forgiveness doesn't rewrite history. Forgiveness just simply says, God, I'm giving you what I can no longer carry. And maybe that's your next step today. Not forgetting, not pretending, not minimizing, just releasing one hurt, one memory, one person at a time. Because healing begins where surrender starts. If this episode struck a nerve today, good. I'll consider that a mission accomplished. But all jokes aside, I truly hope that this sparks something to start a fire in someone who desperately needed to hear it. Please rate and review the show on whatever platform that you're listening or watching from. It helps with the numbers. And share with a friend who you think could use a little bit of encouragement today. Super excited for next week. Thank y'all for hanging out with me for a little while today. And next Wednesday, I'll be coming at you with some more. I'm just going to close in prayer. Lord, thank you for seeing every hurt, every wound, and every betrayal that we've carried. You know the pain we don't talk about and the scars that we try so desperately to hide. Today, we choose to release those who have hurt us into your hands. Give us the strength to forgive as you have forgiven us. Heal the places that still ache within us, God. Free us from bitterness, resentment, and offense. Help us to trust you with justice, trust you with our healing, and trust you with our future. We surrender every hurt to you today and to you alone, God. May the Lord bless and keep you. May the Lord to make his face shine brightly upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and fill you with his peace. Amen. Thank y'all.
You were never meant to live half seen, half heard, or half you. No more hiding. No more pretending. Drop the mask. Ditch the act. Just truth. Just fire. Be her. Just the woman God created you to be. Uncovered, undeniable, and wholly unmasked. And she has no more no's to give. I'll see y'all next time on Wholly Unmasked.